On the morning of October 26, 1970, a woman named Nancy Benalak didn't show up to work. Her coworkers called her sister. Her sister called neighbors. Her neighbors confirmed Nancy's car was still in the parking lot. They asked the apartment manager to open her door. What they found ended any chance Nancy had at the life she was 3 weeks away from starting. She was 27 years old. She was engaged to be married. And the man who killed her, the man police interviewed, the man whose alibi was accepted, the man who walked away from that investigation and went on living his life, was living in the same apartment complex, 50 feet away. For 27 years after Nancy's death, he was never charged. He died in 1997, still free. And then, in 2022, on what would have been Nancy's birthday, a retired detective who had turned herself into a volunteer got a phone call from a laboratory. The DNA matched. This is the story of how a cold case from 1970 got solved by a daughter who never knew her father, a detective who refused to quit, and a piece of technology that didn't exist when Nancy died. Who Nancy was. Nancy Marie Bennallack grew up in Grass Valley, California. She was an athlete in high school, softball, song leader, the kind of person who showed up and made things more alive. She bowled on weekends with friends and family. Her sister Linda later described her as someone with a fierce appetite, despite being slender, the kind of detail that tells you more about a person than a biography ever could. After beauty school, Nancy worked at a salon on South Auburn Street. A friend convinced her to take a trip to Hawaii. She went, worked at a salon there for a while, came back to California, and got a job as a court reporter. She had found her footing. She had a fiancé, Ferris Salami, a chief public defender. They were 3 weeks from their wedding. On the night of October 25, 1970, Ferris walked Nancy home after an evening out. He said goodnight around 11:30 p.m. Nancy was in bed when he left. She always left the sliding balcony door slightly open so her cat could come and go. That detail, a sliding door left open a few inches for a cat, is the detail the killer was counting on. The crime scene. Crime scene investigators reconstructed what happened that night. Sometime between the evening of October 25th and the early morning hours of the 26th, a man climbed to the second-floor balcony of Nancy's apartment. He had duct tape wrapped around his fingers to prevent leaving fingerprints. That detail is important. It means he planned this. He came through the open slider. He killed Nancy inside her own home. When he left something behind. A trail of blood, crimson running from the balcony across the sidewalk, ending in the parking lot. Investigators concluded the suspect had likely cut himself during the attack, a wound on the hand or arm. The blood trail suggested he got into a vehicle and left. That last assumption, that he drove away, that he was an outsider to the neighborhood, would cost the investigation decades. He didn't drive away. He walked home. Deputies also noted something that would haunt the case for years. The crime bore striking similarities to the murder of a woman named Judith Hakari, killed earlier that same year. Both women were approximately the same age. Both lived within a mile of each other. Both were engaged to be married. 2 women, same profile, same neighborhood, same year. The connections were flagged. They went nowhere. The suspect who walked the sheriff's office interviewed over 500 people in the months following Nancy's murder. Among them, a 27-year-old man named Richard John Davis, who lived across the apartment complex from Nancy. Davis had a history. He was an alcoholic. He was known to be prone to violence. His temperament was documented. But he had an alibi, provided by his roommate, and detectives had already convinced themselves the killer was an outsider who had driven away from the scene. Davis was a neighbor. That didn't fit the theory. There was something else detectives didn't think to check. His arms. The blood trail leaving Nancy's apartment suggested the attacker had sustained a cut, a knife wound. If Davis had been checked for wounds that night, if anyone had thought to look, the investigation might have ended in 1970 instead of 2022. Nobody looked. Davis walked away. No charges, no deeper scrutiny. And because he had only one prior, a minor DUI, he was never entered into CODIS, the National DNA Database. The system that might have flagged him later had no record of him at all. He spent the rest of his life less than 50 feet from where he had killed Nancy Benalak. He died in 1997. Cirrhosis. Alcohol-related complications. Free. The cold case years. For over 3 decades, Nancy's case sat. Not forgotten by her family, by the system. In 2004, forensic technology had advanced far enough that investigators were able to develop a usable DNA profile from samples collected at Nancy's apartment in 1970. Law enforcement began running that profile against state and national databases. Weekly, for years, nothing matched. The suspect had either committed no crime after Nancy's murder that put him in the system, or had spent decades careful enough to avoid it. Either way, the DNA sat in a database with no name attached to it. Then, in 2005, a homicide detective named Mickey Lynx picked up the case. She worked it. She retired. She kept working it as a volunteer, unpaid, on her own time, because she had made a decision that Nancy's family deserved an answer. In 2019, Lynx rejoined the investigation officially. That same year, the Sheriff's Office and District Attorney's Office launched a forensic genetic genealogy investigation, uploading the DNA profile to an open-source genealogy website designed to find relatives of unknown DNA sources. The science was new, the approach was unconventional, and it was about to break the case open. The daughter who never knew him as investigators worked the genealogy database. A thread emerged. They traced it back toward Richard John Davis, the same man interviewed in 1970, the same man who had given an alibi and walked away. Davis had a daughter, a child he had never sought out, never supported, a girl born from a marriage that ended before he had any interest in being a father. Detective Lynx tracked her down. The daughter was in her 50s. She had grown up without Davis in her life. She had no particular loyalty to protect him. What she had was a choice: to help or not to help in a murder investigation involving a woman she had never met, connected to a father she had barely known. She listened to Nancy's story. She gave investigators her DNA. The laboratory compared her DNA against the blood samples collected from Nancy's apartment on the night of the murder in 1970. The result came back on June 13, 2022. Nancy's birthday. It was a match. Richard John Davis, the neighbor, the man with duct tape on his fingers, the man police interviewed and released in 1970, the man who never left. The news reached Linda Cox, Nancy's sister, on Nancy's birthday. Detective Lynx called her personally. There would be no trial. Davis had died 25 years earlier. No charges, no sentencing, no moment in a courtroom where Nancy's name was spoken aloud and justice was formally attached to it. What Linda got instead was the truth. After 52 years, she finally knew the name of the man who had killed her sister 3 weeks before her wedding. She knew he had lived across the parking lot. She knew the detectives who questioned him in 1970 had been a single instinct: check his arms, away from closing the case that night. She knew her sister had been killed by someone who planned it, who wrapped duct tape around his fingers before he climbed that balcony, who most likely knew Nancy was getting married and could not accept it. In her statement, Linda said she and her husband had often thought about what Nancy would have made of their ranch, the animals, the open spaces, the grandchildren she never got to meet. What forensic genealogy gave Linda wasn't justice in the legal sense. It was something older and quieter than that. It was an answer. And a retired detective who had spent 17 years on a case that wasn't her obligation anymore made sure Nancy's family got one.